One of the most defining features of our epoch has been the total disconnect of the ruling elite and establishment from reality. We saw Joe Biden, who in his deluded megalomania provoked a war, a proxy war with Russia in Ukraine, and insisted on continuing that war long after it was clear that it was lost. Another product of that process was Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, who in a recent article in The Hill was called the Mad King of Kiev, touring Europe and Western countries, demanding money, and again, pushing forward a war that is obviously lost, with the sole, plan of provoking a clash between the United States and Russia, which could be, in potential, if it came to be, a disastrous event. We've seen many other examples of these, but in the past week, there's been another few of those. First of all, we have Emmanuel Macron, who went to Washington in order to set Donald Trump straight, show him what he's about, and manhandle him physically. Although he came back with very little to show for it. And perhaps one of the most bizarre things that I personally noted was Friedrich Merz, the soon-to-be Chancellor of Germany, the leader of the Christian Democratic Party, which became number one in the German elections, and his extreme jubilance in spite of the fact that his party had gotten the second worst result in its history since World War II. And while at the same time going through elections, which has cost all of the establishment parties very, very dearly. This was not a victory at all. This was a massive blow to the German political establishment and the ruling class, and the projects of the ruling class, so to say, since World War II. Now, we will deal today with the question of German elections. We'll discuss the changed balance of forces internationally, and at the same time, we'll discuss the mineral deal that Donald Trump has been negotiating with Volodymyr Zelensky. My name is Hamid Alizadeh. I'm here with Jorge Martin, and this is Against the Stream. Now, Jorge, I think we should start with the German elections. Mm-hmm. Friedrich Merz is going to be the most unpopular chancellor in history to take office. Only 32% of the population support him. His party, the CDU, and its Bavarian counterpart, CSU, got 28.5% of the vote.
Which is even less than what they were predicted
polling
to have in the polls.
Yes. This is the second worst poll, only behind the previous result, only behind the previous one in 2021, where they got 4.5% less. The SPD, the traditional counterpart of the CDU, the Social Democratic Party, got 16.4% of the vote, which is the lowest going back to the 1880s.
Yeah, someone said that Engels was alive the last time the SPD got
formerly the party was
bad as that.
Formerly the party was a Marxist party back then, yes. And on its way up actually because of that, mm-hmm. Because as it was becoming the party of the German working class. The Greens, another coalition party, received 11.6% of the vote. The FDP, the liberal right-wing, also coalition party partner, got 4.6% of the vote. As far as I understand, that means
out of parliament.
They're out of parliament.
Yes.
And in fact, they were the ones who precipitated the collapse of the government by defying their agreement about not touching the debt ceiling. Anyway, that's a different matter altogether. Now, meanwhile, you have the biggest, success of these elections went to the AfD, the Alternative für Deutschland, which got 20.8% of the vote, which is a doubling of the previous results. And also, we saw a surprise surge in the results of Die Linke, the left party, which got about 9% of the vote, if I'm not mistaken. And also to mention, we should mention the BSW, the Sarah Wagenknecht Alliance, which was around Sarah Wagenknecht, a former Die Linke leader, who's recently set up a new organization, which is a mix of left-wing socialist rhetoric mixed with anti-immigration rhetoric as well. And she got, or her party got, 4.97% of the vote, which leaves her just below the threshold for entering parliament, although they might still enter on the basis of local votes, as far as I understand. But I'm not sure about that. Now, as I said before, this is being portrayed as a major victory for the CDU and the CSU. Merz looks jubilant. He's out there looking powerful, saying we're going to change things around. We're going to change the direction of Germany. He has lots of plans. But in reality, he's going
to be the leader of Europe against Trump.
Exactly. But in reality, this was a huge blow to his party and to the whole of the German establishment.
Yes.
If I'm not mistaken, this is the lowest result that the two establishment parties have had for decades.
Yes. They used to get 60, 70, 80% of the vote on a regular basis.
Yeah.
And now this is completely gone. This is a reflection of the crisis of the regime in Germany, which has been brewing for some time. But I will say that there is a turning point in the situation, or maybe two turning points. The 2008 crisis of capitalism. But if you remember in 2011, 2015, when the debt crisis in Europe, the debt crisis was mainly affecting peripheral countries in the European Union, mainly Greece, but also Portugal, Spain, Italy. Now the crisis has arrived at the center, the core of the European economy, that is the German economy.
Yeah.
So that was one turning point. Then I would say the other turning point is the war in Ukraine, right? I've got, I'm not sure if I printed it, but there is a graph that shows that up until 2022, the percentage of people who said the country is going the right way, country is going the wrong way, was more or less stable and almost the same, like a 50-50 split. At that point, there is a big jump, right? There's about 70% or 60% of the people think the country is going the wrong way. And this was not directly because of the war, but because of the impact of sanctions on Russia, on energy prices and the deindustrialization of Germany. At that point is when this coalition government, three-way coalition government, liberals, social democrats, and the Greens, becomes extremely unpopular. And it took another 2 or 3 years for it to fall, but that was the end of it, and that's the turning point.
Yeah.
So this result really reflects a big crisis for the two main established parties, and therefore for the way in which the German ruling class has ruled the country for a very long period of time.
Yeah, we've talked about it before in the show that in the past years we've seen a 20% decline in industrial production, and another 20% on its way predicted to come in the next period, which is a huge blow to Germany. Germany was the last, you can say, remaining Western industrial nation,
power,
as in other countries also have industry. The US has significant industry, but it was an economy mainly based on industry, the auto industry and the chemical industry in particular, but lots of different advanced industries, machine tool production. However, due to the lack of investments and basically just letting just, how do you say, living off past achievements, and mainly benefiting from one, exploitation of increased exploitation of the workforce,
which was made possible by the reforms under the Schroeder
under the
government,
SPD government,
the Hartz 1 and Hartz 2
in the early 2000s,
labor reforms.
yes, and cheap gas from Russia, which was again something that came about in the following years. There's the Nord Stream pipelines and so on and so forth, and exports to China, which was growing at that particular time, and also the euro crisis, which initially depreciated the euro, to which the German economy was linked, which means that they had basically their goods were cheaper on the world market outside of the EU. Now, all of those things had nothing. None of those things had anything to do with actual investment, and in reality, investments froze. The way that Germany dealt with the euro crisis, other countries, and that particular period, the 2008 crisis, other countries dealt with it by taking up huge amounts of debt, which we saw reflected in Greece. You saw the most extreme version, basically a state default. But also the situation we see all over Europe now, with most countries having more than 100% or 110% debt ratios, with the huge amounts of money being spent on paying these debt and interest rates. But Germany did the opposite. They put a debt ceiling, which is now a point of contention, at 60%, that they're not allowed to have a debt that's higher than 60%. Incidentally, I think is at 63.5% at the moment. But at the same time, they stopped investments. You saw the complete collapse. You've seen the complete collapse or decay of German infrastructure, and lots of areas where you would see investments into improving, let's say, internet and other important infrastructure to actually add to development, to actually add to industry and so on. This has been completely lost. And the main parts of benefit, profits from the main source of profit from the German industry has been by using the state to protect the major German industries, so that basically they could live off of the cream of the past.
I'd say the biggest example of this, which we have discussed before, is the car industry, isn't it? Car industry, the internal combustion engine industry, is very big in Germany, Volkswagen being the leading of that. And this is now being overtaken by electric vehicles, in which China has a massive competitive advantage. And now we see for the first time, Volkswagen is discussing closing factories inside Germany for the first time of history. That's kind of a clear example of the economic crisis in Germany and where it comes from. Lack of investment, lack of new technology development, and so on. And
at the same time, you saw price hikes, inflation, which really weighed down on people. The freeze also means a freeze on increased social benefits, which were already quite low. It was the standards set by the social democratic government. Which again, in a time of deep crisis, meant increased pressure on the public sector, on benefits, and these kind of things. In France 24, they had an interesting article about the Rust Belt towns. This is something new we begin to see in Germany. Before, you talked about massive modern industrial towns. In terms of Rust Belt, it was mainly in East Germany. You talked about lack of industries and so on. But now that's beginning to move to the West. And they interview someone in, I think it's in Duisburg. He's a former SPD member who switched back to the AfD. He says, so many companies are closing. It's just not possible for people to come here and just go and work. He's talking about immigrants, because that was one of the main topics of the election. This is a 63-year-old man, and he said he works for the steel titan ThyssenKrupp, which last year announced that it was cutting 11,000 jobs in the face of rising Asian competition. The mood is bad, this guy said. Nobody knows who's affected, which departments are affected, what comes next. This is the level of instability, the insecurities, the sense of where are things going that people are feeling. And it's the establishment parties have governed over this, and they don't have any solutions to this. The only solution they have is more of the same, more of the old, more attacks. And in fact, we talked about this before. Volkswagen is talking about firing 10% of its workforce and a wage decrease of another 10% for the other ones, which means what? Massive rise of the class struggle, massive pressures on the working class, with all of these establishment parties basically seen as the main culprits or responsible.
Yeah. So in this situation, it's not surprising that the AFD has gotten a very good result. And in fact, if you look at the breakdown of the vote by social groups, I mean, these are not exact Marxist categories, but these are the categories that be used by pollsters. And it basically says that amongst industrial workers, blue-collar workers, industry and construction, the AFD has now become the first party.
Yes.
Jumping from 21% of the vote in 2021 to 37%. That is 37% of blue-collar workers have voted for the AFD. And this is very significant, and it needs to be explained in one way or another. And you can see how the other parties, mainly the SPD, has completely collapsed amongst this is the party that was in power, the main party of power prior, has gone from 26% of workers, blue-collar workers, voting for the SPD to 12% now. It's been a massive
and of course, it was a lot more before. This is the traditional party of the working class.
That's right.
In Gelsenkirchen, which is another former industrial town, is in a former mining town, the SPD used to have 60% plus of the vote. Then, let me just find this here. I have some of my figures here. Used to get 60% of the vote. Lots of immigrant labor. And in fact, this town was always highlighted as a place that shows it was a melting pot. You have people from all over the world coming. You arrived one day, you had a job the next day, basically. And everyone were integrated into one unit. The labor movement was enormously strengthened. But in the past years, mining has been closed down, industry has been closed down. This is now the lowest average. Gelsenkirchen now has the lowest average income of the whole of Germany, which is less than 18,000 euros per year. That's nothing. That's nothing. And the unemployment rate is 24%, which means that what? This time around, rather than the SPD coming and sweeping the whole thing, the AFD got 24.7% and became the largest party. Came first.
This coincides with these other figures, this breakdown of the vote for the AFD, and it says that there is a graph that shows the plots, the vote for the AFD and the GDP per capita in the different electoral districts.
Yeah.
And obviously, in all those places where the GDP per capita is lowest, is where the AFD gets the biggest vote, up to 40-50%. And then where the GDP per capita is highest, around 100,000 a year and so on, then the AFD vote is lowest. So it's a clear correlation. Then the industrial areas where there are the largest percentage of industrial workers, the AFD gets the biggest amount of votes, and this is then compounded if these places are in the east, in the former East Germany, then the vote is even bigger. But the correlation also holds for West Germany, i.e. the towns where there's the highest number of industrial workers, blue-collar workers, the AFD gets a bigger vote. So, I mean, that tells you about the class composition of the vote for the AFD. This is coming from the industrially depressed areas, the poorer areas, and the areas where there's more industrial jobs. That's the character of the job. So the question that needs to be answered is why are these industrial workers and poorer layers of society voting for the AFD? And this is
because just before you answer, because the main question, if you look at the bourgeois media, most of them at least, the main question of these elections have been immigration. in reality. And then at the last minute, the idea of Germany's place in the world has also been mixed into it. In essence, the CDU has taken on some of the nationalism of the AfD, talking about Germany first, or in other words. But immigration has been the main thing. The AfD says this is the main. Essentially, this is the number one problem of the country. The old governments have just been opening the doors. Merkel allowed 1 million refugees to come, which is correct, which is what they did. And that has put too much pressure on our system. People come here and take our benefits. And that's the main problem in Germany.
Yes.
Essentially.
Yes.
While at the same time they talk about they need to decrease taxes, a smaller state. They have a very libertarian outlook on
There's another element of the AfD program, which is the question of the war in Ukraine.
Yes.
Right. So they are against the war in Ukraine.
Yeah.
But I'd say this is less of a foreign affairs issue and more of an economic issue.
Yes.
because the question of the war in Ukraine is directly linked to energy prices,
Yes.
which have caused the sanctions on Russia and higher energy prices, higher inflation, and destruction of industrial jobs. So it's all linked up. And even the question of immigration is also linked up with the economy, because
Yes.
obviously it's very easy in these conditions to say, oh, the problem is there's too many immigrants,
Yeah.
right? The problem is not that the German capitalism is in crisis, but the crisis is caused by too many people. It's very easy. But why is it easy for the AfD to say this? Because no one is saying anything else,
Yeah.
right? And you have the main parties saying more or less a different version of the same thing.
Yeah.
The CDU is also saying, we need to control immigration. The SPD is also saying, maybe we need to control immigration.
Yeah. But in reality, they're all, as you said, they're all really using this to distort from the fact that the real vote behind these things, as you say, is the economic vote, is a class question. Look, in Gelsenkirchen, I think is the best example. A city that's known for its vibrant multiculturalism in a period of an economic upswing, where the economy is moving forward, people have what they need, and then in a situation where everything is in reverse, poverty, massive amounts of poverty. This is one of the most advanced countries in the world. This is one of the countries with the highest productivity per worker in the world, which allows this level of poverty, this level of income, which is a third world level of income in many places, right? Yeah. So the extreme income inequality and the extreme rage and anger this produces, and the lack of any real alternative to this for years. We'll get to the Linke, which has a very interesting lesson, which proves the same thing. But up until now, there hasn't been a consistent how do you say,
explanation or
alternative to reflect any of this. As you said, the Ukraine war, it's a class question again, and the AfD are the only ones who portrayed themselves as this. There was
all the other parties are in favor of the Ukraine war. The SPD, the Greens particularly, the FPD, and all the other parties have exactly the same policy on the Ukraine war.
The Financial Times had an article on the 21st, is called "How Scholz's Party is Losing Ground in Germany's Industrial Heartland." They went to the Ruhr region and talked with people, and the message was the same, that nobody represents us. But then you have the AfD coming up and actually trying to speak the language of the working class. One of the candidates says the SPD has become a party of high earners, is no longer a workers' party in the classic sense, and we are taking on this role. So they portray themselves, they say, it's not just a question of saying it's the immigrants' fault. What is actually resonating probably more than anything with people is saying it's the establishment's fault. They are thieves. They're a similar phenomenon to what we saw in Germany. They have been mismanaging the whole thing. They've been taking down the country, and you are the ones paying for it. And they're not stopping immigration, and so on and so forth. But in reality, what resonates is the class element, the anger and the rage that is there everywhere in the working class.
In fact, if you look at where the votes for the AFD come from, you will see something that's very interesting. This is the one. This is where the votes for the AFD come. The new votes for the AFD come. 1.8 million from people who abstained in the previous election.
The forgotten people.
People who were already sick and tired of the whole system, never bothered to vote. There's been a higher turnout this time. Then 1 million come from the CDU.
Yeah.
So 1.8 million from abstention, 1 million from the CDU, 890,000 from the Liberals, and 720,000 from the SPD.
Yeah.
And then they had an opinion poll that asked voters of the AFD how did they regard themselves, right? So about 80-something% said that the AFD is a center-right party. Not a far-right party, but a center-right party. Okay, and this kind of makes sense because quite a lot of them are voters of the CDU who've gone over, or some of them are former voters of the SPD. And then the other thing they asked them is, there is a question in Germany about the AFD has not distanced itself enough from right-wing extremism, right? So they asked the voters of the AFD, and 50%, 49% of them said, yes, I agree.
Yeah.
So yes, of course, there is a core of reactionary anti-immigration elements that vote for the AFD, but also a lot of them, they just say, no, look, we're against the system. The system is giving us nothing. The economy is going badly, and all the parties are following the same policies. And the question that needs to be asked really is why is no one saying the same things, not the same things, but giving an explanation or an alternative of why are things going badly? Why is German capitalism in crisis? And what is the alternative?
Yes.
There's no one.
Just before we proceed to that, because I think we need to discuss the Linke as well. But it's quite interesting, the how do you say, the coming together of different forces is quite similar to Trump in the US and reform in Britain, which we talked about last week, in that you have more or less half and half, maybe 60-40, 40-60, but more or less half of the voters for the AFD. The AFD, first of all, in economic terms, is right-wing liberal.
Liberal, yeah.
It's liberal. You know, they talk about...
They describe themselves as libertarian, conservative, small state.
Which is very similar to what a lot of Trump, a lot of all the other ones say. But you have half of the electorate or base coming from the right-wing, petty bourgeois, kind of, CDU, FDP, these are ultra-liberal types. And then you have the other half, or a third, or whatever, thereabouts, coming from the working class, coming from a working class perspective. And it's kind of this amalgamation of these opposing forces in a very particular moment in history. And our task is to understand that, as Marxists and as communists, is to understand the progressive aspirations of the working class people who move towards these things from the reactionary nature of the party itself, its leadership, and this other segment of it.
And one more thing, I was telling you, I think yesterday or the day before, there was an analysis, but I can't remember where it was now. But there was some analyst from Germany, and he was saying, well, the problem with the AFD is that people in East Germany, they haven't had democracy for a very long time. They don't have democracy in their brains and in the tradition, and therefore they vote for anti-democratic parties. That's not an explanation at all of anything.
This goes to the heart of the matter, because they say, this is the liberal idea, this is a far right. First of all, far right, what does that mean? If it means that they're fascists, certainly as a party they're not fascist, but there are fascists
certainly
within them, definitely. Yes. But far right, isn't it far right to support mass murder of people in the hundreds of thousands in Palestine, in Gaza, or support a war in Ukraine, whether they went ahead with it willingly or not? The German bourgeoisie supported the war in Ukraine, which has destroyed a whole nation. Isn't it far right to oversee?
And it's also destroyed the German economy.
Germany and overseeing the exploitation and the oppression of the German workers and poor for decades. All of the ills that have befallen the German working class in the past.
That doesn't look very progressive to me.
These are far right people, in essence, right? But they say, well, we are not racist. In reality, they're just as racist as well, but maybe they're not as crude in the way that they talk about it. But they're just as racist as well. And this guy is saying, oh, this is the idea of the German liberals, that the East Germans are not fit for democracy.
That's right.
They're too stupid for democracy. That's always what the liberals say, that poor people are not, the people who vote against them.
They're ignorant.
And because they don't agree with them.
Yes.
So they don't understand, and so maybe
it's a bit like the Romanian election, isn't it? The people voted for this guy because of Russian money or because they're ignorant, and therefore they cannot be trusted with the vote.
Now, Die Linke has doubled its vote. It's interesting because about 6 months ago, Sarah Wagenknecht's party looked to get about 10% of the vote. Die Linke was around
below the 5%
threshold. But now they turned around. Die Linke came in with 9% in the past few weeks, more or less. And Wagenknecht halved her support. Die Linke came first amongst the youth.
With, was it 24% or 27%? Let me just get the figures.
You have the figures right
there.
Let's get
under 25% for the Linke.
Yeah, that's a huge thing. In Berlin, they won.
Yes, came first. And
even
more amongst young women, they got 34%.
Yeah.
So that's even
better. Now, a lot of people have said this is mainly due to a deal, an anti-immigration law that was posed by Merz in the past few weeks and supported by the AfD, which meant that a lot of people who would have normally voted for one of the establishment parties or CDU were disgusted by this and terrified of the rise of the AfD and these racist laws. They flocked to the Linke. And I think there's an element of truth.
That played a big role. It made a lot of people angry and activated them into politics. But there's more than that.
Exactly, because in the past few months, in fact, the Linke has been taking an increasingly class position. Also, the slogan was, other people want to govern. We want to change things, right? And they've been they've put up demands, slogans regarding attacking billionaires. They have taken up a radical position
on rent controls, which is a big issue in big cities like in Berlin, for instance.
Huge thing. And in effect, by just tilting slightly over towards a more radical class-based approach, they doubled their vote. This shows...
And doing a campaign, I think some of the leaders have explained that they realized that they were going to be wiped out and they changed tack. So they basically went on a massive campaign of door knocking. 100,000, I think, before the election, 300,000 during the election, in which they talked to working class people. And they realized that one of the main issues was rent. Another issue was the question of the economy, inflation, and they started talking more about these questions. And that's where they got the votes for.
So this idea that, we hear sometimes, the rise of the right and the society is moving right, but with the slightest little squeak from the left, they double their vote. And in reality, if they've done it before, and in the next period, if they continue down this line, they would go even further. Now, meanwhile...
and if you add to that the votes for the BSW, although it's not exactly the same thing because they have this position on immigration, but the BSW is much clearer than the Linke on the question of the war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza, where they've taken a very clear position. If you add these two parties, that's already 15% of the vote.
Exactly. Now, one of the reasons why the Linke had been reduced to such a level, in fact, in the past decade, we've seen them several times getting decent amount of support and votes. But the problem was, repeatedly, they
joined coalition governments or supported coalition governments with the SPD carrying out austerity policies.
Exactly. And also locally, they joined a whole series of regional governments. And that shows you if you participate in managing capitalism, your party will lose. What you have in the AfD and other such parties are people who are completely from the outside, who are seen as not a part of the establishment, and who attack the establishment. The harder, the better. And
can I say that this also affected the BSW, because the BSW did two things in the last few months. One, voted for that motion on immigration with the CDU and the AfD.
Yes.
So some people said, okay, if this party is the same as the AfD, we might as well vote for the AfD.
Yeah.
But another thing that they did is that they entered into coalition talks, and I think in one case entered a coalition government in two different regions. Was it in Saxony and in
Brandenburg with SPD, and in Thuringia with the CDU?
Yes. So they entered into coalition talks or coalition government or supported coalition governments in these places.
A few months after being formed as a party.
And therefore they lost their appeal as an anti-establishment for many people. I think that was an important factor in them not getting the result that they were expecting.
Exactly.
And if you look at this, what is it? Let me just find these other figures, because this, I think, is very significant to what you were just saying. If you look at the voting age, I had it printed, let me see. If you look at the voting age of here it is. The voting age, you have to go up until the 45 to 59 range to get the CDU first. In all the voters and the 45, the anti-establishment parties of the right and the left, the AfD and the Linke, come much higher than the establishment parties. So this is also a generational thing, isn't it? And what does that tell you? The youth is that generation, or the youth in this case, all those up until 45, seems young to me, 45, all those up to 45, is the people who have never lived in any other type of capitalism, isn't it? The capitalism that is in crisis is now, 17 years since 2008. So everyone who's grown up in this period, the only thing they've seen is capitalist crisis, and these two parties alternating in power, attacking the working class. And that's the age range where these parties are most discredited.
And now the talks are of another grand coalition, possibly. Another CDU and SPD, the two major parties of the ruling class, forming another government together.
Which is madness for the CDU, but it'll be fatal for the SPD. That can be the destruction of the SPD as a party. They're already very low in the opinion polls. Now they're going to be part of a very unpopular government, carrying out very right-wing austerity policies against the working class. And what do they expect to get from that? It's complete madness.
One of the things that...
And this will strengthen the AfD. Clearly, because they will be the only opposition party. Well, perhaps the Linke a little bit, but...
Because let's just to finish up the Linke, I mean, they've had this success, but you sent me an article...
An
interview with the historic leader of Die Linke. What's his name?
Gregor Gysi.
Where he basically says that... Maybe you should read the quote, actually. I think it's...
He says he's apparently written a book called Marx and Us, and he talks about some of Marx's predictions, such as the collapse of capitalism, have been proven to be false. Instead of talking about social revolution, we should be talking about social innovation and gradual successive transformation of society. And then he says, Gregor says, yes, that's what I said in my article. Says, sometimes leftists have difficulties with realities when they contradict the ideology, and says we need to analyze exactly what capitalism can and cannot do. And this is amazing. Scandalous, I would say. It says capitalism can produce an efficient economy. Imagine that. In today's world. in today's world, to say that capitalism can produce an efficient economy. It says it can produce excellent science and research. Not in Germany. It can produce excellent art and culture. And then he gives an example, says Bertolt Brecht is the product of capitalism.
Who's a communist.
This is complete madness.
Yeah.
But he basically says, we need to take the best of capitalism and the best of socialism and social justice. And these are the ideas of these people. Even when the Linke talks about the billionaires and attacks the billionaires, what they basically saying in practice is we need to tax the billionaires. They're not posing a real alternative to the system as a whole.
Yes.
They just want to tinker with the edges of
Yes.
it. And then, like for instance, in relation to rent control is a very good demand, but at the end of the day, you cannot solve the problem of housing within capitalism as long as these houses and flats are owned by private, massive corporations.
Yeah.
But then, in the same interview, Gregor Gysi says, and yes, this is no problem. We should collaborate with different governments because the interviewer, this is in the Jacobin, asks him about, but the participation of the Linke in these coalition governments has had bad results.
Yeah.
It has destroyed the party electorally. He says, no. The question is that we need to be we need to be realistic. We need to be joint coalition governments. So anyway, what I'm trying to say is that the Linke uses its newfound electoral success to follow this kind of policies that will collapse the same way that they collapsed in the past. So
it's quite mad because the ship is sinking. Capitalism is in a deep crisis. Anyone with eyes can see.
Which is provoking a polarization of society.
And anyone with their eyes open, or who have any eyes, maybe if they don't even have to be open all the time. They can see that this system is going down, is in a terminal state of decline. And just at the deepest crisis of the system, it's true that capitalism has led to innovation. Many decades and hundreds of years ago, at a certain point, capitalism did develop the productive forces. At a great cost for the working class, by the way, but nevertheless, they did develop the productive forces, science, technique, and so on. In the post-war period, there was a brief revival, we can say, for very particular reasons. Massive support, the opening up of the world market to world trade, which really gave a huge boost to productivity. Massive support of America. Also,
the fact that Germany was prevented from investing in weapons.
Exactly. Security guarantees by America, in essence, which are now no longer the case. But what do you have today? You have a world market in decline, the beginning of mutual recrimination and trade wars. Germany is an export country, mainly is an export-oriented country. At the same time as America is pulling away its security guarantees, meaning that Germany will have to invest in defense one way or another, a deep internal crisis at all levels. And this guy is...
a leader of the Linke.
The leader of the Linke is clinging on to this sinking ship. Well, if you cling on to a sinking ship, what's going to happen? You're going to sink
under.
with it.
Yeah.
You're going to go under with it. What we can see it really means, what really has an impact is that the lesson from this event is that class politics is the way forward.
Yes.
And that's the ship you need to to tie yourself to.
And this has led not only to a good election result, but tens of thousands of people now joining the Linke, being part of this organization, fighting for these things.
Yes.
And this is extremely progressive. But I'm afraid that the leaders of the Linke are going to ruin this whole situation.
They're talking about changing things around in Germany. We have to invest. First of all, I think 99% of what they say is just hot air.
Yes.
You got to invest in industry and infrastructure, and they're not going to do that.
How?
A lot of that money is just going to disappear. And secondly, for which market? The world market is shrinking, if they haven't discovered. Everyone is trying to export their crisis. Everyone building tariff barriers. So what's that going to help them? Because the market they're going to export to is going to shrink. Then they have to militarize. And they're saying, well, we're going to remilitarize Germany. Germany is going to be the leader of Europe, and so on and so forth. And who's going to pay for this? Well, it's going to be the working class. And debts. We're going to remove the debt ceiling. That's not going to solve any of the problem.
But can I just say a detail about this debt break? What the debt break says is that the government cannot borrow more than, I think it's 0.35% of GDP every year. And that is already preventing them from spending the whatever hundreds of billions that they want to spend in weapons. But that's a constitutional requirement, right? So in order to change that, they need 2/3 majority in parliament, which they do not have, because both the AFD and the Linke have said that they're not in favor of breaking the debt. The AFD as a principle, because they are liberals in economy, and Linke because they say that we don't want to change the debt ceiling in order to invest in weapons. Okay, so they don't have a 2/3 majority. What now Merz is proposing is to use the old parliament. The old parliament can still meet while the new government is not formed for I don't know, a period of a month. They want to recall the old parliament with a majority that no longer has a popular mandate to pass a measure that's going to be extremely unpopular. This is going to, if they do that, I don't know whether they will or not, but the
they're quite serious about it.
Yeah, if they do that, they will very quickly, even before the new government is formed, completely destroy the legitimacy of this government, which is already very weak in any case.
You see, they're talking about having a firewall around the AFD, which is an anti-democratic force. And then they carry out these kind of policies.
Which is not very democratic.
Which is the exact opposite of democracy. Now, we see, as a part of Merz's rhetoric, it's clearly become a lot more nationalistic. Essentially, as we predicted, America first will also mean Germany first and everyone else first. Everyone's going to say us first. And of course, in a situation of crisis, everyone is trying to carve up their part of the world trade, world economy, and so on, and protect their own markets, protect their own industries. One of the things that these new parties have been saying, the AFD have been saying it, reform, they talk about the nation. We need to protect the nation. They're against the EU. They want to either reform or destroy the EU completely. And we saw this, by the way, also J.D. Vance. He came to Munich a couple of weeks ago and made this speech, which was in essence throwing the weight of America behind all of these parties, i.e. to support this trend of nationalism, rising national independence, not independence, I would say, sovereignty, against the European Union. Now, recently I had a conversation with someone who is very, very fervently in support of this trend. They said nationalism is the way forward. The whole problem is that all these nations trying to collaborate, but they can't. But in reality, if we look at the problems of Europe is, I think, the world's biggest market, if I'm not entirely mistaken. 700 million people on relatively high incomes. A lot of advanced countries, but the biggest problem of Europe is not so much that the European Union is stifling development, which it is. The European Union is a very, very reactionary force, especially the bureaucracy. But it's precisely the nation states, precisely that the ruling class of every tiny little enclave, Germany is one of the larger ones of those, want to maintain their own interests. Yes, Europe together, but us first. But that's, if they all say that, that means that there's a limitation to how they can develop. In fact, one of the bases for the economic growth of the past period was the partial dismantling of these national borders, at least on economic. In economic way.
But this was only possible. This was only possible partially in a period of economic growth. Because when the, let's say, the pie is growing, it's easier to share it out. When the pie is decreasing, then Germany says no, Germany first, and then Italy says no, Italy first, no, France first, and
and because all of them, not only are they losing their profits, they're protecting their profits, but all of them have angry working classes behind them. Who want their share, and instead of obviously giving up their profits, which none of them want to do, they blame the other guys and they try to export their crisis.
And this reveals the real position of the European capitalist powers, isn't it? Because they are all very weak.
Yes.
So they have a certain tendency to hang together for fear of being hanged separately.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there's another tendency, which is that they're being pulled in different directions by the bigger powers.
Yes.
Right. So Italy. The only way that Italy is saying, okay, we want a good relationship with the United States.
Yes.
Meloni is a friend of Trump. And Elon Musk is offering Starlink for the Italian army. But Starlink is not a European project. In fact, the European project, which I think is called IRIS-2, will not come on stream until 2027 or 2030 or something. It doesn't exist. So this is the problem, and then Germany is being pulled in another direction. Merz thinks that he will unite Europe against Trump, but in fact the centrifugal tendencies that now exist within the European economies, which are all in crisis and all in terminal decline, will prevent that from happening. There will be no unity of Europe against Trump. Rather, Trump will divide and destroy the European Union as a force.
And they're all saying we want to unite Europe against Trump. Macron is saying that, and we're going to get to him. Well, let's move on to Macron now, because if you see the major powers emerging now, it's the U.S. and China first and foremost. But then at the same time, it's also Russia. And what is the how do you say, the unifying, the common denominator here? These are one nation, one ruling class. It doesn't mean that we're in favor of that ruling class, but by dominating these
over a bigger number of people, a larger
bigger landmass,
territory,
a bigger territory, a bigger army, a bigger economy. With a one ruling class, they might have their own internal divisions, but it's one ruling class doing these. Then they have an easier way to maneuver. Whereas we saw last week how Europe, as soon as it tries to do anything independently, it's like a Monty Python quiz, like how do you say, sketch, like everyone walking one way or another, trying to falling over each other.
In fact, but this is something that Marx and Engels explained 170 years ago. They said that two main barriers for the development of productive forces that were created originally by capitalism, private property, and the nation state have turned from a progressive factor against the particularity of feudal counties. You create the national state and the national market. That was progressive at the time, but they have now, 150 years ago, have now become obstacles for the development of the productive forces. And this can be seen in a more acute form in Europe, because each one of these capitalist countries is much smaller than their rival competitors in the world.
It's an irony of history that it was Europe. This was the place where capitalism was born. And it's precisely the same process that led to the expansion of capital, i.e. the removal of these local barriers of feudal society, with every little town and city having their own trade barriers and tax barriers and ruling classes and so on and so forth.
Weights and measure systems.
Cleaning all of that, creating one market, actually was a huge boost to development of capitalism. But the thing is, once capitalism then saturated that particular market, it was wedded to that. And it had to go beyond it. And into the world scale. And then you saw the same thing happening in other countries. Britain, France, Germany, all of these began to develop, saturated their own markets, and then went on to compete against one another, where they met with the same problem that they overcame initially. The same problem of particularity of a ruling class and a, independence, discrete state, separate from one another, compete against one another. And that is precisely was pulling Europe down as it is. Now, Martin Wolf wrote an interesting article.
He's the head
economics,
the head foreign international affairs writer of the Financial Times.
Financial Times. He says, and the title of the article is "The U.S. is now the enemy of the West." He says, "These past 2 weeks, have made two things clear. The first is that the U.S. has decided to abandon the role in the world it assumed during the Second World War. With Trump back in the White House, it has decided instead to become just another great power. Just another great power, indifferent to anything but its short-term interests, especially its material interests. That's nothing new, by the way, just to say. This leaves the causes it upheld in limbo, including the rights of small countries and democracy itself. This also fits with what is happening inside the US, where the state created by the New Deal and the law-governed society created by the Constitution are both in danger and destruction. In response, Europe will either rise to the occasion or disintegrate.
I think it'll be
it's the second. It's the second, isn't it?
But anyway, Martin Wolf makes a number of silly points there because the United States was never defending the rights of small nations or liberal democracy. It was always defending its own interests. But where he is right is that in the past, the United States wanted to exert its dominance over the whole world and is now retreated. Number one. Number two, he's also right in saying that the United States is no longer an ally of Europe.
Yes.
In the past, it wasn't really an ally. It was more like a protective umbrella for Europe. The relationship was not one of equal allies.
No.
The United States dominated. But now the United States sees, or Trump, the wing of the ruling class that he maybe represents, he sees Europe. Some of them are discussing, do they see Europe as an adversary or as an enemy even? In any case, a rival on the world scene for markets, from an economic point of view and so on. And therefore, this explains everything that Trump is doing. They're no longer interested in paying for the protection of security, military security of Europe. And therefore, they're quite prepared to arrive at a deal with Russia, which is a much bigger, more important power. And that's it. It's like a group of gangsters who control one neighborhood, and the other ones control another neighborhood, and that's it. They're carving up the world in a much more open way than in the past. He's right on something else. The United States never defended the rights of small nations or liberal democracy, but used the excuse, the facade of that. Like, for instance, when they invaded Iraq, when they attacked Iraq for the first time in 91, they said, this is in order to protect poor little Kuwait.
And then they pulled out. No, sorry. Also the Kurds, wasn't it? They appealed to the Kurds.
Yes. And the southern Marsh Arabs in Iraq. They said, we're going to protect you. And then they pulled out and they allowed Saddam Hussein to massacre them. Yeah. So anyway, the United States has never been in favor of the rights of small nations. But in the past, it used to cover up its real imperialist ambitions and interests in its foreign interventions with a facade of liberal democracy, multilateral institutions, and so on. Now Trump has decided to destroy all of that and say, say what is, right? I'm interested in Greenland because of shipping lanes and trading routes and minerals. I'm interested in the Panama Canal because this is very important for the U.S. economy. So it's telling everyone what
I guess
what is.
Under the previous administration, they would have sent the National Endowment for Democracy to Greenland to set up an independent media funded by millions of dollars of U.S.
Some NGOs promoting democracy or something.
Exactly. But I mean, there's a couple of things here because there's a lot going on which reflect precisely this change. The U.S. is pulling the rug from under the feet of Europe.
Yes.
J.D. Vance came to Germany, and his main point of his main speech was to support the AfD. That was his whole the whole aim of his speech, and all of these other parties. In essence, in order to create to reinforce the centrifugal forces which are developing, the nationalist forces in Europe, to tear Europe apart so as to easier dominate it. They've made it no secret. In fact, they've said today they want to impose 25% tariffs on the
European Union.
They've said many times before they want regulations, EU regulations taken down so they can export to the EU easier.
Yes.
And they want European companies to come to Europe.
And freedom of operation for US technology companies.
Exactly. Because we know that there's certain barriers for Google, for Facebook, for all of these, Apple, and so on and so forth. Now...
But can I just say that this is what they're doing, right? Trump, Vance, and Musk. But they are not the cause of this... of the rise of these right-wing demagogic parties. They're not the cause of the disintegration of Europe. These are processes that were going on before. They are an accelerant. That's
they're
clear.
pouring a bit more oil on the fire, so to say.
But to answer the question of Martin Wolf, he says that in the last paragraph of his article, he does say Europe has two options. Either they unite together and they present a common front in this new world and so on, or the European Union will disintegrate. And it's quite clear to me, from what we've been discussing, that this is impossible. The European Union is subject to a crisis of capitalism, which is intensifying all the centrifugal tendencies. And each of the ruling classes of Europe, however weak they are separately, they will fight against each other. They will be pulled in different directions. Some will be pulled towards the orbit of Russia. Some are already. Some will be pulled in the orbit of the US, and everyone else will be left China floundering, and there's nothing they can do about it.
And we saw two examples of the impotence of Europe this week. Let's take Macron first, just because I find him so pathetic. Macron, again, a bit like Matt, living in the clouds, thinking, "Oh, we are
extremely weak at home."
We are extremely weak at home. I mean, he's weaker than Matt. Matt at least just can probably form a government. Macron cannot even really form a government. He's a lame duck. His party has no majority in parliament. There'll probably be elections in the summer where he will be one way or another removed. And he went to the US in order to show Trump. And it's funny because it's surreal to watch these, I don't know if you've seen the videos of Trump and Macron. Everyone in the bourgeois media talking about the handshake. Oh yes, Trump tried to dominate him, but Macron was prepared. And it's all about how these two guys were arm wrestling, basically. And there's lots of it. There's one point where Trump seems to be taking his hand and he's kind of dragging him after him. And Macron went there to look fierce. So,
he was even at one point contradicting Trump in the press conference.
Trump said, we're giving the Ukrainians all this money. The Europeans have only lent it to them. And then Macron said, no, that's not the case. And it's all for show. Because he went there to show how strong Europe is. And he went there to get Trump to invite him into the negotiations and to give them security guarantees for Ukraine. They're terrified. What's going to happen? Ukraine is going to fall. Russia is going to be strengthened. What about us? And Trump gave him nothing. And he came out just looking stupid. And you listen to him. You actually listen to it. He just looks like a stupid schoolboy.
There was a European Union official who said, what did he say? This trip has been completely useless. This was the sum up of the summary that he was given. The number of European leaders were given by Macron. Macron came back and he briefed the European leaders about what he'd gotten from Trump. And this guy, senior European Union official, quoted in this article, said, "This trip's been completely useless. I got nothing precisely." Which really reflects the real balance of forces between the US and Europe.
And next week we have Starmer. Is it next week?
No, today.
Today Starmer is in Washington. They're going to meet. I'm sure that that's going to be even more pathetic. Starmer seems
more pathetic because Starmer, before going to the US, has already made lots of concessions. He's cut the British foreign aid budget in order to fund an increase in military spending, which he thinks Trump's going to be very happy about, and then he's going to give him something. Trump's going to be very happy that he does what is told, and he's not going to give him anything precisely.
If anything, someone like Trump sniffs weakness. He's going to go for you. Then we had the vote at the UN, which was ridiculous. It was the 3rd anniversary of the war in Ukraine. The Ukrainians had put forward a motion attacking Russia for starting the war, denouncing Russia. And this had the full backing of all the Western countries. Then the new US administration puts forward a new resolution which
at the Security Council,
which is very, very brief and just says what we need is peace. And it doesn't talk, it talks in totally neutral language about all of the different parties, right? It's interesting that the Europeans don't want that, but it's clear because they don't want peace. They actually don't, because for them peace means America leaving Ukraine and them as well,
and Russia being
strengthened, victorious. They then amended the resolution so as to say that it's basically adding in anti-Russian rhetoric. The Americans ended up voting against it, and the West voting collectively in favor of it. Then in the Security Council, the Americans,
which is where it counts. Because remember, the UN General Assembly can vote whatever they want. They voted so many times for Palestinian statehood, against the embargo on Cuba. It doesn't mean anything. The vote that counts is the Security Council. Although,
even there, who's going to enforce it? Yes. Americans put forward a resolution along, I think it's the same.
Similar, yeah.
And they vote jointly with Russia and China to get. This is the first time since 1954, forever. No, I think forever.
Okay, but in '91 they voted some joint resolutions for the war in Iraq.
But I think China
abstained at that time.
This is the first time the three of them vote together, and Britain and France, the big
are against. They are against,
but they abstained.
Yeah.
This is the great
remember European that if they voted against, because the Security Council has the right to veto, they will have stopped the resolution from going ahead.
So all this talk.
So it's all talk. Yeah.
It's all complete nonsense. Yeah. It's all just talk. But it also shows the new world order.
Yes.
Which is going to be decided by America, China
and Russia.
Yeah, and not Britain of all of all countries.
Yes.
Now,
can I just say one small point? Because some people, maybe not so much now, but even a few months ago, people were saying the US domination of the world is bad, this is imperialism, therefore what we need is a multipolar world.
Yeah.
And now we have a multipolar world, right? Is that any better? It's not better at all. It's not better to be dominated by three pirates than to be dominated just by one. What's the difference? There is no difference whatsoever.
Yeah.
So,
I think lots of people will cheer on the defeats that the U.S. has seen, but what does it change fundamentally for the working class? Unless this defeat is by the hands of the workers, who then take power in their own hands, fundamentally won't change much. And in reality, we see the result now, because the last point we wanted to deal with is this Ukraine mineral deal. It's a bit unclear what the deal really is. In essence, I think we can say it's not really finished, but there's a preliminary part of the deal. There's a framework agreement which has been reached, which says that 50% of all new explorations on Ukrainian soil, that's gas, oil, minerals, rare earths, all of these things, 50% of the proceeds from these will go to a special fund which will be managed partially, jointly by the Americans and the Ukrainians.
But by the Americans,
in effect, by the Americans. Now, this is...
and then it's not clear how the money in this fund is going to be used. Because it talks in very vague terms about once a year reinvestment in Ukraine, but it doesn't say that it will be exclusively to reinvest in Ukraine. There's all this talk that the US is going to take a cut out to pay for its previous investment.
I mean, Donald Trump has made it clear that he wants $500 billion back.
Although he never spent $500 billion.
I don't think he spent that much, but it's clear what he wants. He wants money. He wants wealth. He wants to
and resources.
Yes. He wants to secure that for American capitalism. And obviously that's an imperialist policy. But we also have the liberal establishment coming out.
Which supported Ukraine because of national sovereignty.
Yes,
isn't it?
they talk about national sovereignty, but you see, a lot of them are saying, "Oh no, this Boris Johnson went ahead and said
This is a
robber deal."
deal.
And it's true. It will mean turning Ukraine into a colony. But
someone said the original terms that were being proposed were worse than the Versailles Treaty.
yes, and Boris Johnson went out and said, "This is a robber deal, but we have to support it."
Yes.
So all of this,
Because it's the only
this
way,
talk
because
about-
they think that this is the only way to get the United States interested in Ukraine,
exactly.
so that there will be at least some, I don't know, security guarantees, which Trump has
Exactly.
already said is not
Exactly.
part of the deal, will never give any.
They think if the Americans are making money in Ukraine, they want
We're
to
interested
protect their business.
it, yeah.
And in reality, obviously, that doesn't mean much, but it does mean that the idea of Ukrainian sovereignty has never been a problem for these guys.
No.
For them, it's very, very cynical.
Yes.
You know, we talked about. You sent me some of these things. There's
been a statement today by the Minister of the Armed Forces in France, and he said, "Oh, we've already been negotiating a mineral deal with Ukraine since October last year, because it's actually Zelensky, in his madness, in order to defend national sovereignty of Ukraine, was offering Ukraine for sale to anyone who will buy it." And he's now said, the French Minister for the Armed Forces, I think, he said that, we were already negotiating with the Ukrainians since October. And he says, unfortunately, whether you like it or not, the war and the economic interest, they all get mixed up.
He says, it's Radio France, he says, whether we like it or not, economic issues are always intertwined with military, strategic, or security issues. In any case, this is particularly true of energy. Now, this shows the real attitude.
Yes.
The idea of Ukrainian sovereignty has never been a problem for the Liberals. In fact, Ukrainian sovereignty was given up a long time ago by the Ukrainian nationalists. And the way, it's true that Trump's particular way of imperialism is quite a crude, unrefined one, let's say. It's like a
real estate,
like a street. It's like a real estate businessman, precisely. Whereas the other ones were more refined, well-spoken, hidden behind layers of agreements and papers, but
nice phrases.
But the fact is that Ukraine ceased to be independent as soon as it gave in to the modern version of Ukrainian nationalism. You know, you mentioned before that the Biden administration was pushing for lowering the age of conscription in Ukraine. Why is a foreign country doing that?
Yes.
You know, they talk about foreign interference. Why is America telling the Ukrainian government what age to set for the conscription? What makes it worse is that 80% of Ukrainians are against it. So
because
talking about democracy,
they know that these people, if they're conscripted, young people will go to die as cannon fodder to the
we remember
war that cannot
very
be
well
won.
just after the Maidan movement had overthrown the previous Yanukovych government. There was a leaked conversation between Victoria Nuland, who was a deputy secretary of state under Biden last year. She retreated last year, I think. She was talking on the phone with the American ambassador in Ukraine, and they were discussing who should become the prime minister.
Yes.
And they were saying,
Yatsenyuk or Poroshenko.
Exactly. Imagine this. A state functionary, you know, when we talk about the deep state, this is the people we're talking about, a state functionary, and the American ambassador in a country deciding
who's going to be the president,
or having any say in it whatsoever.
The prime minister.
The prime minister, yes. And
not to speak of the fact that just a few months earlier, both Victoria Nuland and Senator John McCain were present at the Maidan Square protests against the government.
Against the elected government.
You can think whatever you want about the Yanukovych government. He's a gangster and an oligarch, but here we have officials of a foreign government in the streets agitating the masses to overthrow this government. I mean, just imagine for a second that, I don't know, a Putin official was in the United States trying to change the course of the US election. I don't know.
And incidentally, the Maidan movement, which was heavily infiltrated, organized, and led by extreme far-right elements. So
Yes.
they talk about democracy.
Yeah.
Here they have fascists leading a movement, and their top politicians
Supporting
it openly and conspiring behind the scenes about who to put in government and who not.
All in the name of national sovereignty of Ukraine.
Exactly. And now all of these people who talk about, oh, this deal is imperialist and Trump is an imperialist and we were not. They all support the deal anyway because they all have an interest in America maintaining the stance, as you said before, of dominating every single part of the world.
And in the meantime, I will say that one of the most scandalous parts of all of this is that this is now 3 years of this war, but the conflict obviously goes back to 2014, when the Kiev government organized a so-called anti-terrorist operation against the Donbas republics and all of that. So this has been going on now for 10 years. And hundreds of thousands of people have been killed, working class, youth, and not so young people. Men from Ukraine and from Russia, all in the interest of what? No, not in the interest of national security, in the interest of the U.S. trying to put down Russia. Right? This is a proxy imperialist war. And now Kellogg, the U.S. envoy for Ukraine, he said the terms of the agreement, or he said the guideposts for the agreement are going to be the 2022 framework agreement that was signed in Istanbul. So in April 2022, they had an agreement, which is now going to be more or less the basis for this agreement.
The new peace.
In the meantime, hundreds of thousands of people have been killed, infrastructure been destroyed.
The whole
for
country
what?
is
For nothing.
destroyed.
For nothing.
And Biden was pushing this.
Yes.
He was pushing it again and again and again. And Zelensky was pushing it. But one thing, you said this, Trump has been accusing Zelensky for provoking this war and continuing it in spite of all rational, reasonable reasons. But it was Biden that was behind them.
That's right.
It was the West that was pushing them.
Yes.
It was the Americans that was pushing them because of this extreme arrogance and hubris, and they destroyed the country. And now what we're going to see is Ukraine being carved up. The Russians, this mineral deal, I think suits the Russians quite well. The Russians have said, we don't want any European peacekeepers. But to be honest, I think they might agree with that because that will give them leverage over the Europeans. To have the Europeans and the Americans with interest in a country that Russia is a dominant player in, that gives them a card that they can play. They're not against that. They did it in Syria as well. But that's a carving up of Ukraine. And even if Russia had been defeated, it wouldn't have meant an independent Ukraine. It would have meant the same people who now dominate the other part of Ukraine would just dominate the whole part. The idea from back then, 2014 or before that, actually, 2004 or 5, where we had the Orange Revolution, was a Western-backed movements to overthrow Russia-friendly governments. The idea of Ukrainian sovereignty was finished. The idea of Ukrainian independence was finished. Ukraine would either be a pawn of Western imperialism, or it would be within Russia's sphere of influence. And in fact, this is something we were at a conference, a meeting recently, where one of the comrades was saying precisely this. This is now a major thing. What will happen to Ukraine? What will happen to the Ukrainian people? They've just been sacrificed in the little game between major powers. And in reality, what we see is that, and this is, I think, something we're going to see a lot more of in the next period, that for these smaller countries that come in between the major powers, all talk of sovereignty, independence, there's going to be less and less space.
And in fact, the rights of small nations are used as small change by the big powers in order to justify the imperialist ambitions. This is something that Lenin already explained 100 years ago during World War II, World War I, which was about the rights of poor little Serbia and poor little Belgium and so on. That was the excuse.
Everyone said, let's go and protect those. And in reality, behind that
was the imperialist
interests of these people.
In fact, I was telling you before, and what this comrade said, Emmanuel said at this meeting of the leadership of the ICR, he said, in fact, the only way to guarantee that the sovereignty of Ukraine makes any sense is through the rebuilding of the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
The workers coming to power in Russia, in Ukraine, and rebuilding the bonds of friendship and brotherhood that existed in the past. Going back to the Russian Revolution.
Yeah.
In fact, if you think about it, Putin said Ukraine is an artificial creation of Lenin and the Bolsheviks. And he's against that.
Yeah.
Obviously, Ukraine was not created by Lenin and the Bolsheviks, but Lenin and the Bolsheviks, when they came to power, they gave Ukraine independence on the basis of a Soviet regime. And Lenin insisted that when the Soviet Union was formed in 1922, it had to be a union on equal terms of Ukraine, Russia, and the Transcaucasian Federation. It was three separate entities that came together to form a union of equals. And I mean that's the only way. I remember that in 2015 there was a comrade from Ukraine, Dmitry, and he said to me, you see, Lenin created Ukraine, and the Ukrainian nationalists have destroyed it. And this is very true, because when the Ukrainian reactionary nationalists came to power in 2014, they were basing themselves on, one, the oppression of the Russian minority, language oppression, cultural oppression, but also because they were basing themselves on the historical tradition of the Bandera, the Ukrainian insurgent army, and the Nazi collaborators during World War II. That will lead immediately to a massive split in Ukrainian society along national lines, therefore destroying Ukraine as a viable entity. And this is what really happened.
I mean, Ukraine might have been set up by by Lenin, but actually throughout those years, it's true, because of some of the mistakes of Stalinism. There was no full integration, let's say. The national barriers remained, a certain Ukrainian nationalism remained. However, there was also a deep level of integration of these people who weren't, seeing each other as oppressor and oppressed, but as equals. And Ukraine was developed economically under the basis of a planned economy.
And the economy was integrated.
The economy was totally integrated into the Russian economy. Culturally, there was a big level of integration. Obviously, geographically, Kiev is relatively close to all the major urban, industrial centers of Russia. And in fact, we had a comrade a few years ago who talked to me, a Russian comrade, who said, well, I used to go to holidays in Kiev all the time, and I used to speak Russian. Most people spoke Russian. Ukrainian was not the main language, as far as he explained to me. And obviously, that's all. But that also shows you the level, what it means to have a NATO country in that particular, to have an aggressive outpost of U.S. imperialism right there. What does that mean? That is a direct threat to Russia, and that's what Ukraine was used for. It was used as a pawn to establish a springboard of attacks, political, cultural, military, economic, into Russia, in order to subjugate it. By the West, that would have been.
But if you think about it, the Western imperialism, or U.S. imperialism more specifically, knew about this all along. There's so many reports by U.S. intelligence and analysts and so on. They said, if ever the question of Ukraine joining NATO is posed, that's a red line for Putin and the Russian capitalism oligarchy, and they will not accept that. They will invade. Right? Okay. They knew this. So you could even say, okay, if they know that, at least they will be prepared to go all the way and let's say defend Ukraine until the end. But no, they're not prepared to defend Ukraine, because they're not prepared to put ground troops in Ukraine, because they know that's going to lead to a military conflict with a nuclear power. So why did they start Why did they start the war from the beginning? The only reason is that they believed their own lies. They thought that they could defeat Russia and put Russia in its place, subjugate Russia on behalf of U.S. imperialism. If you remember that speech that Biden gave in Poland at the beginning of the war, he was talking about this cannot end before there is regime change in Moscow.
Yeah, that was the heart of this project.
Complete madness.
And here we go back to the starting point of this podcast, which is the total cognitive disconnect of the Western liberal leaders. You know, I can't remember where I read this, but I read it somewhere. Trotsky wrote that when it's time for a regime or a social system to go down, history will find the right leaders to do so. And I think that's what we see here. We see a system in total decay, the tops of which have just gotten so used to living, that they live in such a bubble, and they believe their own propaganda. They believe their own lies. They believe their own, and they think they're all powerful, and they think in the end, nothing much, you know, they might be setbacks or this and that, but they're not going to lose power. Well, that's not the case as we can see in America. And also in terms of Russia, what did this prove? It proved a complete lack of understanding of reality. On the one hand, they failed to appreciate that Russia has developed militarily, industrially. It's bounced back from the extreme backward barbaric state of
collapse
the 90s, collapse of the 90s.
Yeah.
But also they didn't understand the mood of the Russian people. The Russian people have a history of decades of hostility towards American imperialism, which tried to destroy and crush the Soviet Union. That was one of the main missions of America. It's the whole reason for the setting up of NATO and all of these things. The Russian people remember how America oppressed them and humiliated them in the 90s. The Americans ran Russia. They went in there and did anything they wanted.
Under the leadership of Yeltsin, who was a drunk.
Who was a drunkard. In fact, the Americans helped put Putin in place. There's evidence of this, transferring money to him, to his campaign and so on and so forth, although they didn't understand what Putin stood for. And
in fact, can I say, even Putin, what he wanted at the beginning was a seat at the table. He wanted to be a partner of the West. There was even talk of Russia joining NATO and all that.
Of course.
But the arrogance of U.S. imperialism, which wanted Russia subjugated, obviously led Putin in a different direction.
Exactly. And the Americans helped him along. The Russian people also saw what NATO did in Afghanistan, what NATO did in Libya, what the West did in Iraq, what the West did in Syria and Yugoslavia. This is essentially...
In Yugoslavia.
In Yugoslavia, that is, when people talk about decolonizing Russia, that is the scenario you're talking about, which is the extremely reactionary outcome. That's why actually the Putin regime, which had a dip in popularity just before the war, was strengthened by this development.
Yes.
There was popular support for the regime, not so much because people love the regime. I'm sure a lot of people do, but from the point of view of the working class, they hate NATO. They want to fight, and they do not want Russia to be subjugated and put in that place. That created the political basis for the Russian military campaign, which is now won. So Biden and the other gang, they didn't understand the economic development. They didn't understand the political situation, the class balance of forces.
And they didn't understand the international situation, because in fact, the reason why US and Western sanctions on Russia have failed is because a whole number of other countries, India, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and a whole number of other countries have helped, and China obviously, have helped Russia overcome sanctions, because these countries are sick and tired of being bossed around by U.S. imperialism. They think that they might be next in the sanctions regime. And now in a multipolar world, if you want to call it like that, they know there's another power that they can lean they can lean on.
But it's funny. It's like postmodernism, just as it's had a pernicious impact on the leaders of the working class, it's also infected the leaders of the ruling class, and they think discourse and PR and stunts. Look at Zelensky, look at Macron, look at Biden. It's like the more we say it and the cooler we look as we say it, the more true it's going to be. But here you have the discourse coming crashing up against reality. And that is the world that we're seeing today, a world of crisis, a crisis of capitalism, which has been concentrated within the biggest power of the planet, of U.S. imperialism, and which is now flowing back into the world system again, reinforcing this crisis, and preparing a period of class struggle and immense instability. Should we end it there?
Yes.
I think that's a good
Sounds
place.
good.
Normally you say the last words, but this
Well,
time
I will say that just going back to something we said before, this crisis, this anti-establishment mood, this class anger has expressed itself in a very distorted manner along the way of these reactionary demagogues and parties and so on, for lack of any other alternative, because of the collapse and the bankruptcy of the left. And our task really is not to lose our heads and become pessimistic or have dark moods about what the world situation. The world situation is bad. The world situation is bad because there's a crisis of capitalism. But what we need to do is to build a real, genuine, revolutionary force based on the working class and the unity of the working class in order to face up to all of this. The crisis of capitalism, right-wing demagogues, anti-immigration moods, and above all, the liberal establishment and their reactionary policies at home and abroad. And this is our task. And the mood is favorable for us. It's a layer of youth who are already very open to communist ideas. But this will not be done automatically. It needs to be built. This organization needs to be built. This is what we're trying to do with the Revolutionary Communist International.
Yes. That's the perfect place to end it. And if anyone out there is interested in joining the Revolutionary Communist International, you can, I think there will be a link in the description of this video, or you can go onto our website, marxist.com/join us. I think that's it for this week. Next week, we'll be back again on Thursday. However, we will publish this recording. We will broadcast at 5 p.m. rather than 3 p.m. UK time. And that's it for today. Thank you very much, everyone out there. Thank you, Jorge. This was Against the Stream, and I'm Hamid Alizadeh.